right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So first off, I want to say welcome to everyone who is joining us on our webinar today. I'm super excited to be a part of this and also be a part of our guests as well. So again, thank you for joining us today. And so today our webinar is called Agrivoltaic Advantage, Secure Your Farm's Financial Future. And we are joined today by Okovate Sustainable Energy. Before I hand it off to them, I did want to do a small introduction of the LandGate team that is a part of this. I am Erica Fleming. I am Senior Vice President of the Client Success here at LandGate, and I help companies like Okovate come into LandGate as a user and make sure that they are getting the most that they can from LandGate and that I assist them in any way that I can with that. And so I am also joined by Eric Hawkins. So I'll hand it over to him.
Hi there, I'm Eric Hawkins. I'm a Senior Vice President of Products and Real Estate Products. I help develop our carbon land use as well as the app, Land app now that you can download and see the estimates on your land for solar, wind, all sorts of different things. You can get free estimates and you can create listings for a variety of different types, including solar leases. And so, if you get to the end of this webinar and you're like, wow, this is exactly what I want to do, feel free to come on, make a listing for a solar lease, and feel free to mention in that you're really interested in solar voltaics, and that can help connect you with different people that are working in that field.
Great. Thanks, Eric. All right. So to do an introduction of Okovate Sustainable Energy, Okovate is a leader in sustainable energy, and we are so excited to share how they are combining solar power with active farming practices to unlock those new opportunities for profitability as well as resilience in agriculture. So by integrating solar energy into farming, Okovate helps farmers make the most of their land, ensuring to work smarter and not harder. And so, to assist in this mission, Okovate uses tools such as LandGate, which provides that real time data on land management as well as renewable energy potential. So, it's helping to make farmers make informed decisions about integrating agrivoltaics into their operations. So, our two people from Okovate today, first off, is going to be Savannah Whitfield. She is co founder and chief operating officer of Okovate. Savannah has a wealth of experience in operations and sustainability and plays a key role in driving Okovate's mission to bring innovative solution to farmers. Also today with us is Jorrit Becking. He is Chief Agricultural Officer. Jorrit's expertise in agriculture allows him to understand the unique needs of farmers, and he's leading Okovate's effort to make agrivoltaics a reality for the farming community. So his work focuses on helping farms thrive by harnessing sustainable energy in ways that benefit both the environment as well as the bottom line. So, in today's session, we're going to be deep diving into agrivoltaics, which is that groundbreaking solution that blends solar energy with farming. And then, as everyone knows, farming is a high risk endeavor when it comes to facing raising costs, the unpredictable weather, and the market fluctuations. Agrivoltaics is here to turn that around. So, in this webinar, you'll learn how agrivoltaics can provide that stable long-term income, improve soil health, add in crop yields, and then as well as protect your farm from the uncertainties of both climate change and the market shifts. So, as always, we're going to encourage you to ask questions throughout this session. Savannah and Jorrit are both going to be here to answer all of your questions there. And so, without further ado, let's jump into today's discussion. Savannah, Jorrit, thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you both.
Great. Thank you so much, Erica. Awesome. Yeah, so thanks for that intro, Erica. You covered the basics about who we are, but I'll give a little more detail about my background and how I got into agrivoltaics. So my first full-time job was at a small startup called Black Bear Energy, and I had the opportunity to wear a lot of different hats as a startup. I got to learn what makes projects successful, what the finances of a solar project look like, and also what makes a project not successful. And so after my 5 years there, I definitely felt knowledgeable about the industry. And I also came out with the realization of how solar isn't perfect. Like there were some problems that I noted, and one of which was the compromise that comes with solar going on active farmland. And so I ended up starting Okovate in 2022 because I wanted to take this knowledge that I got from the solar industry and create resilience for the American farming industry.
Yeah, I'll also give a short introduction about myself. I mean, Erica did a great job already. I have a background in environmental engineering and agronomy, and I worked in agriculture for several years. But I also grew up on a small farm, and you may have thought what a weird name this guy has. Well, that is because that small farm was in the Netherlands. And I actually was never a fan of solar because in the Netherlands we're a very small country, very land limited, and farmers are always complaining about not having land access. So it didn't make sense to me that solar was developed on farmland and then that land would be taken out of production for 30 or 40 years. So throughout time, I started getting engaged with agrivoltaics more and more, and finally, it really clicked for me that the solar development is not going to stop, but agrivoltaics is really the solution that helps farmers solve some of their issues. The biggest one being financial stability, while still being able to continue to farm on that land. And I will talk a little bit more about why that is such a big thing. Yes. So I was actually just at the NFU convention in Oklahoma City, and I just heard so many different problems and challenges that farmers are facing right now. One of them, of course, is increasing climate stress. It is expected that there will be up to 5 times more droughts by 2050. Of course, this depends on where you are, but climate stress is a thing. And all these challenges and pressures have led to increasing agricultural land loss in the US. Over 140,000 farms have been lost in the last 5 years, and these are mainly the smaller family farms that we all like so much. And that's because of increasing costs, fluctuating markets, also aging farmers. But it's important to notice that, you know, the solar development is a real competitor of agricultural land use. It's not the biggest one. There's other forms of development that are taking up more farmland, but solar is one to consider. And it's expected that this solar on ag land will increase tenfold in the coming years up to 2050. So, and it's still in the figure here on the right, you can see a USDA graph that shows that it's still a small part of total US ag land. But the thing is that solar is often developed on the flattest land that is closer to the cities, which also happens to be often the good and productive agricultural land in the US. And I think that is really a missed opportunity. Traditional solar competes with the food system. Tenant farmers and farmers lose access to the land for a long time. And that farmland is also out of production. So that means that not only that it doesn't only affect the food coming from that farm, but it also affects the local agricultural economy. And one thing that a lot of people don't know is that these traditional solar farms also have an environmental impact. Often these farms use land grading. It reduces construction costs because if the ground is very flat, it's easier to construct, but it of course affects the topsoil. And also poor land management during these construction projects leads to erosion, as you can see in the picture on the right, and compaction. And finally, when these systems operate, they often maintain the grass at very short. They maintain the grass very short. They do frequent mowing, and often use herbicides to keep other growth at bay. And Savannah will now explain why agrivoltaics is a solution to those issues.
Yes, thank you. So by now you've gathered the basics, agrivoltaics is agriculture plus solar. That word actually comes from the fancy word for solar, photovoltaics, and then agriculture up there in the top to combine to agrivoltaics or APV, as you'll hear it referred to. And I want to emphasize, a lot of you have probably heard the term solar farms. Unfortunately, here in the US, traditional solar came a long time ago and they coined the term solar farms. But I want to emphasize that what we're doing is different than the solar farms that you've heard of because we are protecting the land instead of removing it from production. And how we're doing that is with special designs that are increasing the row spacing and also the panel height to accommodate for continued agriculture use. And there are three main types of agrivoltaics. Okovate, we specialize in crop agrivoltaics, but we've worked in projects involving livestock and pollinators. As you can see here on the left, the panels are so far apart that there's actually space for the tractor to go in and still do its thing. This design was based on land use, and it's also important to note that some crops are known to even perform better under these conditions. And also, these designs help provide protection against extreme weather, wind, hail, that type of thing. It's just an added physical buffer in addition to a financial buffer. The middle one is livestock. The cool thing about livestock agrivoltaics is that you can get really creative with it. Most commonly, you'll see sheep and cows, but we've heard of people integrating all sorts of animals, even rabbits. Whatever fits underneath the solar panel, it can really make an ecosystem for itself there, and the animals tend to be happier getting to graze underneath the shade. And then the last one over here, the pollinator habitat is a great alternative to just having traditional hay or grass underneath the solar panels. It's low maintenance and it significantly increases the presence of pollinators. And so a lot of folks love having it near where they're doing other farming because it's bringing the pollinators to where they're needed. Yeah, and so this is a little more information about the design. On the left here, you'll see single axis tracking. The little movie is a good example of how the solar panels follow the sun, which allows for the crops to get the sun that they need, but also allows for the solar energy to be maximized. There is also a variation of this where the panels are fixed. It just really depends on what crops are being grown and what we're trying to optimize when designing the system. The middle one here is called vertical agrivoltaics or vertical solar. It's newer, but pretty cool. I actually visited a site in New Jersey that was doing vertical agrivoltaics with cows. And it's nice because it's the least disruptive, I guess. Like, you know, the tractors can still go between the solar panels, and even though the solar yield is lower, there are energy generation on both sides of the panels, and so it still makes up for a good efficiency there. And then the last one is called raised agrivoltaics. It's less common, but it's a cool example to show where there's a big steel structure that is elevating the solar panels, and that just allows for ample space underneath for operations to continue as normal. Great. And I think I saw a question come in. We can take these as they go. I don't know where it went, Eric. Do you see it?
Yes, it's how close to existing electric conveyance infrastructure before it is not feasible or economical. So things like transmission lines, substations, distribution lines.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we look at distance from transmission lines, and then we look at the utilities hosting capacity, and you know, the economics depend on the project, but a good rule of thumb and what we usually source for sites is like 2 miles from a transmission line. And that usually means that we can build it without super extensive construction costs. And then substation proximity isn't as much of a factor because the transmission line is what's actually being connected to your physical site. But oftentimes the substation is within like 5 to 10 miles of wherever we're interconnecting as well.
How does the amount generated compare to exit like traditional solar? And if it's lower, does that mean that like the available transfer capacity, the amount of space in the wires, it can be less of a factor?
Yeah, so the technology is the same, like the design is what's different. So the yield per solar panel of energy being produced is the same, but since they are spaced further apart, the energy density is going to be lower. Um, what was the second part of the question with
Is that
the
that might
wires?
mean that one of the biggest limitations is available transfer capacity for these transmission lines, and so uh,
Mm.
having less of a burden on that potentially.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we like to do that diligence on the front end and make sure the transmission capacity isn't going to be a problem. But, if you take like a 10-acre plot of land with agrivoltaics, that would probably be like a 2 megawatt system. But with traditional solar, it might be like 3.5 to 4. And so using the same amount of land, um, you may be limited with a traditional solar system if the transmission capacity isn't where you need it to be. So yeah, I'll say that can be a factor. Okay, I'll keep going, but please continue to ask questions and we're happy to pause. So let me get into some of the other benefits of agrivoltaics. Um, so the pairing of solar with farmland actually creates an environment underneath the solar panels that's full of different types of benefits that you may not expect. The shade underneath the panels creates decreases the amount of heat stress on crops, which is awesome for just crop resilience, but also can decrease the amount of water needed because there's less evaporation occurring. There's a humid climate that's created underneath the solar panels, which is just great for one, cooling the panels, which actually increases the energy production, and then in turn, yeah, making it more humid and decreasing the amount of water needed from anywhere from 20 to 40%, depending on the crop type and, of course, the climate that we're doing these projects in. But again, my favorite benefit of this whole thing is how it is building farmer resiliency. We, as a community solar developer, provide farmers with an annual lease check. And so it's really just a built-in, reliable annual good check that they receive that they can count on in times where the growing season may not be as good, or there's unexpected drought, or there's a new tariff or something that's making your standard operations less reliable. And the other thing I really want to emphasize is that this is not a new concept. This may be the first time you're hearing about it because it's new to the US, but agrivoltaics has been around for decades, like 30 to 40 years it's been around. Other countries have adapted it for the very reasons we're talking about today. The Netherlands example where land is very valuable and constrained, like you have to be efficient with your land use. And so people have been pairing solar with energy for a very long time. It's tried and true. And where it stands in the US is there are 597 sites that exist. A lot of them exist for research and education purposes. So you'll see a lot of the major universities that are involved in agriculture, they'll have an agrivoltaics research site. And then there are other sites that are not necessarily associated with a educational institution, but they're still existing for like research purposes, wanting to gather data on, okay, how are crop yields being impacted by having the shady environment part of the day? And so I'm going to pass it to Yora, and he's going to highlight a case study that shows you what's going on.
Yes, thank you, Savannah. And I want to emphasize, as you see, that most of the agrivoltaic projects in the US are still livestock and pollinator systems. So the combination of agrivoltaics with crops is still very much in a pilot phase, but results from those pilots have been very promising. And it's also just, I think typically that's some issue that I have, that the sheep grazing often comes down to normal solar development, but then you can put sheep and say it's agrivoltaics, but it's actually just still the same system. Now you're just putting sheep. So I'm not a big fan of those unless it's designed really with the soil in mind. But otherwise, yeah, there is still some work to be done around what is qualifying as agrivoltaics. But of course, what's important is, what does agrivoltaic do to my yields? And the answer to that is that it's very complicated. It depends, of course, on the year and the climate and where you are. It depends on your soil and your system type. But generally, what we see is that if you are in a very arid region, then the crop yields typically increase a lot because you have the heat stress as a limiting factor in your crop growth. So you now take that away and you allow for crops to grow without the limitation of water, because the shade allows for higher soil moisture contents. So that's the top two results that I show here. I think that was done in Arizona. But agrivoltaics is not always going to increase your yield. And I also want to be honest about that. But what is very interesting about agrivoltaics is that actually, if you take away about 30% of sunlight, so you create shading, you see that yields are actually pretty stable. In a lot of places, it's not going to affect your crops by a lot. Like maybe you will have 5%, 10% less yield. And then when you go above those 30%, then you start seeing a faster drop. So we typically try to stay up. Yeah, we don't want to go over the 30% if you're doing crops. It's funny because when you do cattle, there's huge benefits of doing it under agrivoltaics. They love the shade. They love the protection from rain. And you also see that when animals have less heat stress, they are also more productive. So you get a higher, you get a higher yield from your animal because they're not wasting their energy on fighting the heat. One example that I recommend everybody to look at is Jack's Solar Garden. It's agrivoltaic farm that has been around for 5 years now, and they are very public, so they share a lot of their knowledge, and their website is really cool, and you can see some videos, and a lot of the things that we know come from them. So yeah, I would really recommend looking that up. They host also events, and there's a lot of knowledge there. Then I want to get, as I said, I was at the National Farmers Union convention, and it was very interesting to see how much agrivoltaics is talked about right now. Both the Farm Bureau and the National Farmers Union have put out statements that they are supporting agrivoltaics. I think the National Farmers Union is discussing changing their statement a little bit and making it even more focused on agrivoltaics exclusively. And also the USDA has done a lot of research. They support, together with the Department of Energy, different pilot projects, and they have a lot of resources on agrivoltaics and its benefits. And I think that one thing that was talked about a lot is that, we need kind of a policy that defines what agrivoltaics is. And that's something that Okovate really stands for. We are the first agrivoltaics only company in the US, and we really want to set the standard for agrivoltaics. So for us, that means that we want to be farmer first. Solar should support your farming operation and not replace it. So we will always design the system with your land use in mind. We want to be reliable partners. Our team will handle everything from technical analysis to funding and execution. So you really focus on your farm. And for agrivoltaics, it's going to be very different compared to traditional solar, because now you have two land users on the same land. So there needs to be very good communication. And that's why we always stand for being very easy to reach and always ready to help. And we also want to be very honest, because in some cases, agrivoltaics doesn't work. I've looked at land that had very low infiltration capacity. So for example, if you're in a clay soil, and then, yeah, at some point, when there's a big rainstorm and all that water collects on the panels and you can get waterlogging, it might not be the best fit. So in those cases, we are also honest. We don't want to develop a system that doesn't work for the farmer, even though we can still make money of it. We also don't want to pressure you. So one important thing about agrivoltaics is that it is a long lease. You will be talking about 20 to 30 years. So we want you to feel comfortable to take that decision, where other developers in traditional solar sometimes put kind of a sense of urgency, and they include in their language that you have to sign within a certain amount of time, otherwise the deal falls through. Now, we don't do any of that. We want you to be extremely comfortable with what you're getting into, because you're going to be farming that land for a while. And then Savannah will take it over here for, maybe we have some questions.
Yeah, we have some really good questions, I'd say. You
Great.
talked a little bit about, it's been around for decades. Um, sort of question, why hasn't it taken off as much? And are there government funds available for the solar development in this way currently in the US?
Yeah, so I mean, it has taken off in the US in the livestock system, so mainly with the sheep. That's getting really big. But I think that a lot of farmers want to see local pilots. So those results are now starting to come in. But we talk to a lot of farmers and they say, yeah, I mean, you can show that this works in Minnesota, but I want to see a system in Maryland. So we're working also with universities a lot to kind of get these pilot results and give them more visibility. There is funds available for these systems, but that would be more if you as a farmer own it. So I mean, you have the REAP grants from the USDA that would definitely work for that, although it's a little bit unclear if those are still going to be available. But there is also some incentives in some states for agrivoltaics development. So there's some tax benefits that allow us to get a little bit crazier with how we design them, because they reduce some of the construction costs. So there are a lot of incentives throughout the US to support the development of this, but it's still a relatively new technology, and the wave of development there is only just starting. And one thing that might speed agrivoltaics up a lot is that some counties are now banning normal solar development, and they're creating policy language that says, you can do solar, but only if you show that agricultural use is prioritized in that system. And it takes a while to develop this system, but you will see an uptake of it in the coming years.
Um, so one of the things with solar is that eventually the local grid is going to have enough energy on it. You're not going to need as much more. Is there a need to try and get in there sooner, get there first, if you want to be the solar voltaic person in your or agrivoltaic person in your local community?
Well, I'll give this to Savannah, but I want to say, don't feel pressured.
Yeah, I'll echo that. That question can't be answered in a blanket statement. It depends on what state you're in, but even more specifically, what county you're in, and then what utility you're in. Some utilities have lots of capacity, some have enough capacity for a single project. So when you're ready, come to us and we can assess what your hosting capacity looks like. But I will say, Okovate we work with utilities and we're having conversations with them. And if there are multiple projects in a certain community, that gives us power in talking to the utility of like, hey, it makes more sense to do a capacity upgrade here because look at all these sites that are going to be brought online, which can alleviate your capacity need in this area. So we can't answer clearly, but yeah, it just depends. And I also wanted to add one thing about your answer to the government funding. So as all of you have heard, like there's a lot of ambiguity right now with how government programs are being preserved or if they are at all. But I will say, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, there are some incentives that are protected, like no executive order can take them away for solar. What is it called? ITC, which is specifically for clean energy, like that is preserved for the next 10 years. And it gives like a 30% like 26 to 30% return on the capital invested into the system. And yeah, there are others that we can talk about on a state by state basis, but there is incentives for people to build solar still, and specifically solar that's protecting ag land.
Another question is, I think, implementation. Are there solar systems that are compatible with pivot irrigation, center pivot irrigation? How does that work with some of the established infrastructure for farming?
So unfortunately, pivot irrigation is really the one thing that does not work with solar. I have seen solar systems on top of the pivot irrigation that you can use to maybe power the pumps, but yeah, they are also very expensive systems. So sometimes when we look at land where that's in place, and you are not at the end of the lifetime of it, it doesn't make sense to really get a solar system there because that cost is very high. But we can replace pivot with subsurface drip irrigation. But it only makes sense if that pivot irrigation system is at the end of its life, or if there's no pivot irrigation in place. Because if you just have a functioning system, it just, yeah, you lose a lot of, it is too expensive.
This next question is probably going to help lead into this project development, but do you assist with negotiations with the utility to establish connection? And just can you tell us about the timeline of contacting you and then getting to payment and construction?
Yeah, that's the perfect segue into this slide. Really quick, I'll touch on the negotiation with the utility, and I'll say, yes, a lot of our work is building awareness of agrivoltaics. So yeah, we can and have talked to utilities to help understand the need and the grid connectivity. That's something that we do on a as needed basis, and we have relationships with some of the big utilities that we work in right now. But I'm going to give an example of our most recent project, which is in New York with this family who owns sheep. They have about 78 acres of land, and they came to us because they heard of another solar project that was going on in their area, and they were really interested in how they could benefit. And when they heard that we do solar that would still let them like have an environment for their sheep, they were very interested. And so what that timeline looks like is they reached out to us. We specifically Yorit assessed their land. We kind of looked, okay, what kind of soil do they have? Like, what's the topography? What's the grid capacity look like? Is it going to be able to connect to the grid? We like checked all of our boxes to make sure that it worked. That process took a couple of months. It took conversations back and forth with the landowner to understand everything and make sure we were on the same page. And then once we do that, or actually while we're doing that, we sign a letter of intent with landowners. So that is a non-binding agreement that just says like, hey, we're interested in exploring this opportunity with Okovate. It says that we're the only solar developer that you'll work with while that LOI is active. And then it gives us enough information to know like, okay, you're interested enough for us to put time and resources into this project. And from there, we execute on a lease. And so that's when we figure out, okay, how much is this actually going to benefit you guys? This farm, we're developing on 15, 16 acres of land, and they are going to be getting a lease payment of $1,850 per year per acre, and then an additional $250 per year per acre for their sheep grazing services. And I want to emphasize this number varies a lot depending on market, geography, and even like system type, but that's the kind of incentive that this specific landowner is getting. And so we're very close on executing on the lease, which will then trigger some of the early development, like the development permit. So we'll do permits with the utility and the county, and we'll take all the steps necessary for the project to get to what we call NTP, or notice to proceed. That means that it's like ready to be built and everything has been approved and it's just time to break ground. That process, once we're breaking ground, takes anywhere from like 6 to 9 months, depending on seasons, weather, system size, even like remoteness of the site. Like, do you have to bring things in from far away, or is it a little more accessible? And then once the project is done being constructed, that's when the lease payment is triggered. And so for that 20 to 30-year time period, that's when they'll get that annual lease payment. And then in addition, they'll be paid for their services of the sheep grazing the system. So they're essentially being paid for their sheep to eat, and they're doing the vegetation management for the solar system. And I also want to emphasize that with this structure, the landowner isn't paying anything. They're basically like the landlords of the solar system. And so none of the upfront costs fall on them. They just have to sign on to agree that their land can be used for this. And then the rest is done by Okovate and our partners. So going into the more specifics with that question, yeah, so the typical system size, we try to work with at least 10 acres. And we have done projects in Texas. We have a couple folks that we're talking to now. Texas doesn't have a community solar market, but it does have a lot of land and not a lot of regulation. So it's easy to get creative there with different system structures. And that's definitely an area we're willing to look into.
I guess the opposite question, how small, but how large do you start capping out on systems? Is it just you continuously expand, or is it after 100 or 200 acres, you're like, we're not going to build more?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're a community solar developer, so that's not to be confused with like a utility scale developer, which that's like the huge rolling systems that you'll see as you're like driving down the highway. So that answer again depends on the state we're working in. A lot of states have caps on the amount of megawatts that you can use to develop a system, and so we'll usually do around like 5 megawatts, which can be around like 40-ish acres, give or take. But it again, it depends on the spaces between the panels and all of that. But we definitely don't get into the hundreds. That becomes utility scale. Are there any other questions coming through?
Yeah, we'll talk about some of the sort of limitations of it. Someone's got a question about rolling hills of Southwest
Hmm.
Pennsylvania, angles of slope, that sort of things. How limited and how restrictive are y'all's building sort of requirements?
I, I can speak into that. It of course there is some limitations to hills. It doesn't mean that if it's hilly that it's impossible. I would have to see the land, so you can reach out and then we can look at it if it would be possible. I think most systems prefer to stay up to 15% of a slope, but it goes, yeah, I know there's technology that can go over that, so it really depends. One thing with hills that I'm always careful with is the combination of that with what soil type do you have and how sensitive is that to erosion, because that is an issue with hills. But if it's very good well drained soil, then there are systems that can follow the gradients of hills.
Here's a question kind of timeline wise as well. How is Okovate funded during the development? How do you obtain funds that then go into these lease payments as you're, working towards actually establishing the project?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So Oakavate has two different tiers of our business. We have a consulting side where we work with existing solar developers that want to explore agrivoltaics, basically. Like they don't have the expertise that we have in terms of the agriculture accommodations that needed to be done. And so part of our business is funded through doing projects with them. And then we have partnerships like one I'll highlight in Maryland and Virginia is with a developer where we have what's called a DSA, which stands for Development Service Agreement. And so they basically are like, we want projects in Maryland, and we want them to be agrivoltaics projects because there's a whole list of benefits that come from developing agrivoltaics projects, like shorter timelines, less expensive permitting, less expensive operation costs, all that incentivizes them to want to partner with us. And so with them, every time we develop or every time we source a project in Maryland, then they will fund the development for that project. And that's because they are going to ultimately be the owners and operators of that system, and they're paying the lease to the landowner. So we get creative with partnerships like that. And then I'll also say, as a newer company, we've been around about 2.5 years now. We also um, are raising funds through family offices and talking to like angel investors and stuff. So we have a few different avenues, but that's our main business model. And then I also want to emphasize with partnerships like the DSA, like Okovate stays on for the duration of the project. We're not just like, here's a project, DSA partner, and then they take it and run. Like we are involved through the whole life of the project, making sure agriculture practices are preserved, and like we're bringing the farmer advocacy to the project, and just yeah, making sure that's maintained throughout the life of the project.
A lot of good
Um,
questions.
Yeah.
yeah, uh, if we have time for some more before getting back into it, some questions about uh, when talking about agrivoltaics, are they considered agriculture for things like farm bills and ag exemptions, things like that? And then also questions about environmental impact analysis and NEPA approvals, both if you could speak to either of those.
Yeah, I mean, that was a big topic on the at the National Farmers Union convention too. And answer to that is it depends where you are. Ideally, this will be, but it's such a new thing. I hope that in the future this will be updated in policy frameworks that agrivoltaics will always count as agriculture, but sometimes it doesn't. And depending where you are, that land will no longer be considered as agricultural land. So that is a thing to consider when you are looking at the income permit. Like, what does this do to your taxes? That is something to consider, but it might. I think that the policy recommendations that organizations are putting out there is to consider that always as agricultural use.
And
But we're not there yet. And
And do you talk with and help do that analysis with the farmer when you're going through that process?
yes, we will always look at this. And that's usually also the first question we get. Um,
Yeah.
and on the permitting, we will also take care of all of that. We make an analysis of what is needed. We often talk with the county early on and get clarity on what each region needs. We don't do that ourselves. Some of the permits we can do ourselves, but there will always be also an environmental engineering company doing the designs and doing those the technical permits. But the farmer will never have to worry about those things.
This is something about risk for the project if things like hailstorms, but other uh, severe weather, landslides, flooding, anything like that. How is damage from those environmental processes handled? Is there insurance, and who bears the risk for the of loss?
So the system will be insured for that, and that would not be the responsibility of the landowner either. Uh, yeah.
Here's a question about someone who was involved in a potential agrivoltaic project, but were told that the substation was at maximum capacity already. Um, they would still like to move forward with a agrivoltaic project, but is there any sort of suggestions y'all have, or any recourse you think would be available for them, or is this something that they would have to talk about, say, increasing that capacity?
Yeah, you should reach out to us and we can dig a little deeper. We've had some projects where we've done the pre-interconnection application, which basically tells you the hosting capacity, and have gotten bad results. And it really depends on what your motivation is. Like, do you want your own energy to be offset? Are you looking for additional revenue? There are abundant behind the meter and in front of the meter solutions. And sometimes we're even exploring microgrids that allow you to do a lot of the work and get a lot of the benefits without even involving the utility, at least in terms of like capacity needed. So yeah, there are options, but it is case by case. So reach out and we can take a look at it together.
All right. If you all have, we're getting close to time, so if there's stuff you still wanted to talk about in the pow presentation, let's get to that, and then we'll try and get through as many questions at the end as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we have some frequently used questions. A lot of that is already now asked, which is great. I think one thing that's important to know is that equipment is a point of concern for landowners, but the systems are designed with that in mind. We can do drive path analysis and see whether a design allows for their equipment to function with it. One thing that we haven't discussed yet is kind of the flexibility. So for agrivoltaics, it's very important that you are flexible to switch to different land uses, and our project will always allow for that, to have that flexibility. And yeah, how does no cost work? And has been said before, like we basically are a tenant of your land, so we lease it, but you wouldn't be carrying any responsibility or costs for that. But I think we can go to the next. I saw a lot more good questions, so I think we can focus on that, but I'll give it the word to Savannah for the slides.
Yeah, I'm happy to spend the remaining time on questions as well. This is emphasizing what you already know and what we've already told you. We're farmer first. Like that's literally why we got into this. And so we love having sessions like this. We love talking to farmers. And even if you're super on the fence, like we want to talk to you because we want to better understand how we can transition to agrivoltaics as the new standard for solar instead of the traditional systems that are disruptive to our food system. So come to us with your concerns. Um, yep, we are enhancing, not replacing the farmland. We are always allowing continued farming and grazing, keeping the operations profitable while adding the additional revenue stream. And we also like to view this as future proofing. You know, times are uncertain. We can't predict the future, but it's nice to know that once you have an agreement like this, you can at least count on that annual revenue check, which just adds built-in stability for families. One example I like to highlight is that some sheep farmers and cow farmers, like they've made the decision that they can hold on to their calves longer because now this check allows them to buy feed for them in the winter, and then they can sell the calves for more money later in the summer. So there are a lot of ways that it just helps with day-to-day life, helps with operations, and generally builds resiliency, and that's what we're all about. So please get in touch. We're really excited to talk to folks. And yeah, if there are any other questions, now is the time. Scan this QR code and it'll take you to our website where you can fill out an intake form about your farm, but QR codes aren't your thing. Also give us a call at this number or send us an email at farmers@okovate.com. Thanks for dropping those things, Jordan. And thank you everybody for coming and listening to us. We're really excited to be here.
Here's, I think, a really good question. Have any of the farmers you've partnered with seen reduction in crop quality or yield post-solar installation? I know you said yes, occasionally. If so, how did the team navigate that situation? What's the sort of approach if that happens?
Yeah, I mean, the total income from the land is going to be higher. So you will probably see an area on the farmland that you cannot farm anymore because you can grow in between the rows. But if you're using agricultural equipment, you can't really grow directly under the panels because that would be out of reach because there's the solar structure supporting it. So the total usable land area will decrease a little bit. So you will see that would impact your production. And of course, taking away the sun doesn't always mean that you're going to have a better crop yield. In some cases, it will reduce a little bit. One thing that's funny is that I have seen that even though the yield goes down, for example, for pasture, it sometimes leads to higher nutritional value because that grass is grown a bit slower. So it can actually lead to higher quality hay, which can be beneficial. But as I said, the income from the solar leases is going to be completely mitigating that financial impact.
Um, this is kind of a personal question that you, personal interest, but how have y'all worked with, say, renewable agriculture, different things like that, different grazing methods and different mixed crop sort of stuff?
Well, the beauty of agrivoltaics, in my opinion, is that you already create like a kind of like a mixed cropping system, right? Because you have not all the land is within reach for agricultural equipment, so you will have these strips where you typically will have some grasses. They won't grow very fast because that directly under the panel does have more shading, but that does give the land kind of that biological diversity over the horizontal gradient. So I think that is already one of the beautiful things of it. You can also use this very well in combination with rotational grazing. We are very happy to also spend a little bit extra on innovative solutions, like for example, digital collars that can create kind of these intensified grazing strips that move through the solar system. And I've seen multi-cropping as well, where you have each row a different crop, typically in the smaller kind of CSA farms. So there's a lot of possibilities, and like there is some cool research done also on organic matter in these systems, that because you are allowing for a bit more shade, there is a bit of a buildup of organic matter because it's not burning. It's not in the bare soil is not in the burning sun, so you don't burn up that carbon as fast.
Speaking of that, has there been any work with, see, increased in soil carbon content, carbon credits, anything like that that have gone together with this? And can you combine different, say, carbon projects, ecosystem service projects, that sort of stuff? How does that fit in?
So that's a super interesting question, and it really depends on the organization behind it, and it will come down to having a conversation with them. Will you allow this to qualify for carbon credits? But I've seen it, and it's cool because agrivoltaics, as I said, it does allow for a higher organic matter content. So I have seen in Europe systems where that actually did also allow the farmer to sell carbon credits. But these things will come down to the certifying organization and see if they are allowing it. So yeah, we're in the early phase, so we need to have a lot of conversations.
I guess here's some questions. Farms in Georgia, do you all have agrivoltaic projects here? A question about solar being taxed in North Dakota, things like that.
Yeah, so about the tax, like that is very county specific even. So we would really have to have a conversation with the local tax authority. We don't have any system in Georgia. I don't know. I don't know much about Georgia. Savannah, do you know if there's any agrivoltaics?
Yeah, actually we do have one site in Georgia. It's a bit of a it's not our traditional type of system, and so I don't think you've worked on it much, but yeah, Georgia's a solar friendly state and they are in talks of having a community solar program. So it's definitely a market that we explore.
We've got a question of, can you build in town, or can we plan for agriculture and also plan for residential small farms together? I guess we can talk about a little bit of how small can it be and still see benefit from it.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the physical benefits, any size, like there's this farm that I know just outside of Oakville on a personal level in Northern California that has like three solar panels that are like tiny. Like it's not even enough to connect to the grid, but they use it for their on-site farm production and they have like crops growing around it. It's actually an orchard, which is also a unique endeavor, but yeah, you can experience the physical benefits at any size. It's when you get into wanting that leasing structure that you really need to have, like 8 to 10 acres to make it make sense on a commercial level. But who knows? Because things are always changing. We just did a webinar with New York City about urban agrivoltaics, and those systems are really small. But if you have a big portfolio of a few residential homes or a few smaller sites, like depending on the utility, sometimes you can make it work and treat it as one larger system. I know the answer to a lot of these questions are it depends, but that's the truth. Yeah, it's as the technology is rolling out more in the US, every community is deciding how to handle it differently. And so um, it's both cool because you can get creative and you can say, like, well, what about if we do this? And then, somebody may not have thought about that and then they'll approve it. So yeah, it depends.
A lot of
Yeah,
innovation can happen in this space right now, so
Exactly,
it's
exactly.
always
definitely.
reasonable to reach out.
I'd like to add to that so those very small systems might not make sense for us to be the developer, but we also have the consulting side and we have done work with community organizations. And I think it is, we just really like to help to think so we can always have a conversation to see if we can be of help there. And then I saw a question about the 500 acres in Texas. I'm that is a bit above our capacity maybe, but we definitely have connections, so we can still, still be interesting to talk.
We did have a question earlier about have you worked on cannabis projects as part of the growing?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I can speak
go
to
ahead.
that. I'll start you. You can add if you want to. We have talked about it. It definitely can work. It just depends on how people are growing the cannabis. Like we've talked to one indoor grower who wanted solar like more in a greenhouse capacity to power like the pumps and everything. Um, but it can also work for outdoor growers. The the short answer is that it can work, and we've talked to people about doing it, but it's a little less explored because there aren't as many research studies going on about how cannabis yields are impacted by agrivoltaics.
Yeah, being from the Netherlands, I may have some experience, and I do know that it is a plant that really likes the light. Like, so take, yeah, it costs a lot of money to create that light, so it might make more sense to put the solar somewhere else with another crop and use that electricity to offset your cost.
Hmm.
But yeah, it is a light sensitive crop.
We have got, I think, a lot of great questions. This was a very informative webinar. Thank you all so much for being here. Um, we're so happy to that. We're really excited. If you all have more questions, feel free to email us or email Okovate. We'd love to connect with you. I just thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. This has been awesome. We've enjoyed all the questions.
Right. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Eric. Thank you, Savannah. Thank you, Yora. It's been great.
Thank you very much.
Alrighty,
Bye
we'll
bye.
talk soon. Bye.